On Friday at 7:30 in Miller, there is the AU Symphony Orchestra with guest violinist Curtis Stewart. And on Saturday at 7:30 is the AU band concert. So never let it be said that there's nothing to do in Alfred. Today, we're really happy to have Isaac Matson, a US Army veteran with an MA in military history, and is going to give a talk entitled Sand, Sweat, and Swearing. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you. So before I get started with this, I just want to make a quick disclaimer. Everything I say is my opinion and mine alone. I am not endorsing the US Army. I am not here as part of the US Army. I am in no way, shape, or form in an official capacity. So if I say something, this is my experiences, and these videos, these pictures are memory artifacts of my time in the Army, okay? So I just wanted to give that disclaimer up front. Before I start, I'm gonna give you guys a quick video, kind of get you in the mood, get a little bit of the vibe going. This is actually my unit, and I'll actually point myself out just because I'm in it. There's me. And me again. I'm used to a Mac, so I apologize for that. Yeah. Okay, so I entitled this talk Sand, Sweat, and Swearing, Experiences as a Mechanized Infantry Platoon Leader at Fort Bliss, Texas. First one, there's a lot of sand at Fort Bliss. Second, I sweated my ass off. And third, I came from a very conservative Christian family that I never once heard a swear in my family. I never swore in college. Like, I watched movies that had swearing. I joined the infantry, and by the end of my time there, I swore so much, my wife picked up swearing. Now she swears more than I do. So if you hear Dr. Matson swear, it's probably because of me originally, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So sand, sweat, and swearing is the focus. So a little bit about me. My name is Isaac Matson. I was born in Massachusetts in 1990, so I missed the 80s, thankfully. So 90s child. Like I said, conservative Christian family. One of the things that comes with that is an inherent love of God, country, and family. Also happened to be in a military family. Both my father, both my grandparents grandfathers, as well as a great uncle had served in the military. The great uncle. Did I do something wrong? Okay, good. Okay, sorry. Okay. So serving the military kind of was in the family tradition. What happened though was when I was 12, 9/11 happened. So at that point, it was a pivotal moment for me. And I remember that moment to this day. And it ensured that I knew I was going to serve in the military at some point. I didn't really know how at that point, but I knew I was going to. So I continued, made it through high school, started a criminal justice degree at Mount Wachusett Community College, found out I liked it enough to transfer to a state university, finished up my bachelor's in criminal justice in 2014. At that time, though, there really wasn't many jobs in the criminal justice field in Massachusetts, but the Army was looking for officers. I was like, well, I always wanted to join the military. Now's my opportunity. So instead of having gone through an ROTC program or going through West Point, like a lot of Army officers, I decided to go through the officer candidate school. I was accepted in 2014. And in order to do this, I had to go through basic training, like most of the enlisted soldiers. So I got the experience that most officers don't have of being yelled at by a drill sergeant excessively and doing push-ups all the time. Okay, there was something, am I good? Okay, sorry, something, my apologies. So finished basic, I moved on from basic, which was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I completed OCS. When I finished OCS, I was branched. Branching in the military, or at least in the Army, is where we are assigned to a different branch. In the Army, we have things like infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, seaburn, logistics. I got infantry. Does anyone here know what infantry is? Before I give a definition, other than my wife. No one, okay. They're essentially the portion of the military, the portion of the Army that goes and kills the enemy of the United States. Okay, that's the simple fact. Ethics is debatable, but that's what the job is about. So I finished OCS. I went to IBOLC, which is Infantry Officer Basic Leadership Course. I finished that in 2015. I was then assigned to Fort Bliss, Texas, to the 1/6 Infantry Regiment in the 2-1 Armored Division. During my time, I served as a mechanized infantry platoon leader, which is the majority of what I'm going to talk about. I also served as a staff officer in the battalion operations department, and then also as a human resource or S1 officer in the Rear D Brigade when my brigade was deployed to Kuwait. I left active duty in 2018 after the birth of my son Arius. And after leaving active duty, my wife, Dr. Elizabeth Matson, was accepted for a position in the math department here at Alfred University. And we've lived in Alfred Station or Alfred since that time. My son is now almost 5 years old. So that kind of gives me an idea how long it's been since I actually did Army stuff. Come on. Okay. Some quick abbreviations and acronyms for you. So I don't leave you in the dust as I'm talking about. A platoon leader is a first or second lieutenant. When I talk about that, usually I'm talking about myself or one of the other platoon leaders in my company. A platoon leader is in charge of roughly 30 to 40 soldiers. And in the case of myself, I was also in charge of a Bradley fighting vehicles, as well as the 30 to 40 men. My platoon sergeant, the PSG, was the key to success. He was a NCO with years of experience in the Army. One of my platoon sergeants was a 16-year veteran, and I think he just retired last year from the Army after 20-something years. In order for a platoon to work properly, you need to have a good working relationship with your platoon sergeant. As a PL, I could be the best thing ever, but if my platoon sergeant didn't want to work with me, nothing got done, and vice versa. A lot of fellow platoon leaders that I knew at Fort Bliss had an issue. They didn't want to work well with their platoon sergeant. That usually ended up bad, very bad for them. Thankfully, I had 3 platoon sergeants in my time in Fort Bliss. All of them were great. I was able to have a good working relationship with them all. 2 of them I still talk to on occasion. Bradley fighting vehicle, or BFV. It's a battlefield taxi. It looks like a tank. You'll see some videos of it. It's not a tank. It moves troops to and from the battlefield where the infantry can then get out, the squads can get out and attack and secure an objective. Okay, CO is either the company or my commanding officer, the captain who is in charge of company. Company is about 120 men, give or take a few, depending on how we're doing. He's my direct supervisor, and you'll see some stuff about him a little bit later on. Joes, it's the lower ranked enlisted soldiers. I consider them my kids. So how old are you guys? Like what, 17? Anyone 17 here? 18? 19? 20? Okay. 17 to 20 was the average age of my platoon. of my Joes. So you guys are sitting here in college, these guys, this is what they were doing instead. So I really kind of considered them being time about mid-20s. I kind of felt like I had a little bit to offer them. And it was just fun talking to people and kind of giving them some insight into life. Non-commissioned officers. This is what happens when they stayed in, the Joes stayed in the Army for a couple of years. They ended up in a position of leadership. Okay. NCOs are necessary. They're always around. It's necessary to they're the backbone of the Army, as it said. Sometimes they're helpful. There are some really good NCOs. Some NCOs that I had were absolutely horrible. You just have to work around it. NTC, National Training Center. I went to it. It's in the Mojave Desert, California now, and I went to it in August. It's basically hell. And then AWA is the Army Warfighting Assessment, and NIE is Network Integration Evaluation, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go on. Okay, first experience with a Bradley fighting vehicle. I was at IBOLC, and we have been trained as infantry officers, which generally meant we were light infantry officers. In this picture, this guy, a good-looking one behind the Colombian officer who was training with us. What happened, though, was I got in this thing and was like, crap, this is claustrophobic. Why in the world would anyone want to be in it? Then I found out my orders were sending me to Fort Bliss, where I was going to be in one of them. Okay. Bradley fighting vehicle has been around, I think it's like, I don't know the exact number. I think it's about 50 years now, give or take. No, I don't think it, maybe closer to 40. But it's a tracked vehicle, so it looks like a tank. You have a driver's port right here, where the driver, there's 3 crew members, a driver, a commander who sits in the turret here, and a gunner that sits in a turret here. There's 3 weapon systems that are attached to it, a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun, right there. That is used for light vehicles. A TOW, anti-tank guided missile launcher. So if we have to go up against a tank, that's what we would utilize. And then a 240 machine gun, which would be utilized against dismounts or other infantry. The commander's port, where I would see out, is right there. And then we also have a smoke grenade attachment. And then the troop compartment door, which is in the back. So over here is the troop compartment door drop down. As you can see, there's room for 6 soldiers and technically all their gear. So really quite claustrophobic. And then right back here, if you can see this foot and this leg, that's the turret where the commander and the gunner were stationed. So not really comfortable at all. Okay, quick breakdown of how a platoon looks, or a mechanized platoon looks. So you have 4 Bradley fighting vehicles, each with 3 men in it. Like I've described already, you have Alpha section and Bravo section. Alpha section is controlled by the platoon leader, myself. Bravo section is controlled by the platoon sergeant. Inside of Alpha section, we have elements of we have all of first squad, and then elements of second squad in those Bradleys. Like I said, you can only have 6 men in a Bradley, but in Army, on paper, the squad size for an Army is 9 men. So you have a squad leader and 8 soldiers broken down into 2 fire teams. You can't fit 9 men into a 6-man vehicle, passenger. So you have to break it up between 2 things, which adds some logistical complications when you dismount to assault an objective. Second squad is broken down into parts of Alpha section and Bravo section, which makes it even more complicated when we have to get out, because you have to make sure your sections, the 2 vehicles that have those members of that same squad, are close enough that they can link up and then move quickly. And then third squad is entirely in Bravo section. Generally, when there was a mission, I would dismount. Once we got to the objective, my platoon sergeant would stay in the vehicle and command the entire platoon. Yeah, sorry. Okay. 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 Any quick questions? Well, I lost my PowerPoint. Any questions? Anything that I've said that you're like, what the heck is he talking about? Okay. Cool. Within this, I also would have attached a radio operator, or RTO, who would stay with me. They would carry radios. I would carry radios so we could communicate to my company commander as well as to my squads and platoon sergeants. Then sometimes we have a forward observer, and sometimes, or actually almost all the time, we had a combat medic attached, but he would stay with the platoon sergeants. I never had full squads, so there was room in the company to fit in these extra soldiers that weren't the organic portion of the platoon. Okay, that's what it was. Okay. Keep wanting to hit the X. Okay. Here's a couple of examples of formations that could be utilized with the Bradley fighting vehicle. So you have a mounted line formation, kind of moving towards an objective. You can see the overlapping field of fire. Mounted wedge formation. This is what we'd utilize when traveling cross country, which you could do in El Paso, no problem. So you had the platoon leader in section alpha, and would take up the kind of the left side, platoon sergeant and his wingman would take up the right side. And as you can see, we would be kind of covering everywhere to our front and sides. And I just skipped, but it's fine. We don't need to see it. Okay, I kind of talked a little bit about how the Bradley fighting vehicle platoon is set up. Well, I could talk all day about the technical details and stats about it, but these are my men. You look, here's a couple of them all dressed up in civilian clothes. They look young. At least they did to me then. They still look like young to me. Do they look young, guys? No? Okay. Here's the entire platoon in front of our Bradleys. And then another picture of us where we are standing in front of a Chinook. One of the cool things about my time in is I served underneath a CO who really wanted to do cross training. So we had chances to do air assaults using Chinooks, something that normally didn't happen at my duty station. I learned one thing from that. When you wear night vision at night, you end up almost puking. Okay, speaking of my CO, this is Captain Brian Kent, one of the most prolific soldiers I've ever met. He served in Ranger Battalion, then came to be the CO at my Alpha company, 1-6 Infantry. And then after his time as my CO, he went back to Ranger Regiment to serve in operations as a major. He was in the top 1% of all captains of his rank and year group at the time of him being my CO. So without a doubt, there were some great experiences that came from having him as a CO. Okay. When I talk about my time in the Army, a lot of people ask me, did you deploy? Well, interestingly enough, I never deployed. I spent the majority of my time stateside. The reason for this is the unit that I was attached to, 2-1AD, was an entire brigade that was dedicated to being a testing unit for almost 8 years. So what we did was we did 2 major field exercises every year. The first one was NIE. It would focus on using a variety of different networks, so radios, GPSs, that type of stuff, and coordinate them and test how they would work in the future of the Army. And then in the fall, we would do AWA, which would implement new ideas. And we use either new pieces of equipment that hadn't been tested before, or just proxies. One of the interesting things, who here has flown a drone before? Anyone? Flown a drone? Have you guys seen drones, like the handheld operated drones? Okay, so one of the things that's kind of a big deal right now is drones being used in combat. Now, before it became a big deal, we were already testing how to stop that. So here's a video of my company testing out what's called a drone defender. Who's the man? Hey, when you guys you see that gun? That's what's called the drone defender. It would basically shut off the signal that the user of the drone had, and it would force it to land. It would then allow the soldiers to come over, identify if it was a bomb, whether it's taking photos of us, whatnot, and then we would be able to bring it back to our military intelligence, and they would be able to identify where it potentially came from. No. So, yeah. I'm not sure on the details, to be honest. We were handed it and we tested it and it worked. My NCO that was using it, you saw I'm holding it, he complained of having like a stomach bug the entire, or being nauseous the entire time. We just told him he had a stomach bug. He said he had radiation poisoning. I don't know. So I was like, you're fine, man, you're fine. Okay. I'm just gonna keep it like that because it'll be simpler. Is it still going to Zoom right now? We good? Okay. So while the majority of my time was dedicated to these two major field operations. Okay. There, now it should, right? Okay, cool. So before you get to those major training events, you need to ensure that your team and squads are prepared for combat. So one of the major exercises that we did at the platoon level was team and squad live fire. Team and squad live fire, it's in the name, we're shooting live rounds. You had teams of 4 men that would move towards an objective and then assault a building, and then we move up to a squad size mission. As you can see, this is El Paso in, I think it was March, if I remember correctly. So no snow, very different than Alfred. Here's a few videos to give you kind of a feel what it looks like as a team is advancing towards the objective. They're moving towards this building that's in the distance. And what they're doing is a bounding advance where a soldier is firing and then another soldier is moving. And they're doing it in fire team, or the fire team is doing it. There's 4 guys and each 2 soldiers are doing it. So 2 soldiers are firing while 2 soldiers are moving forward. I apologize. Some of the videos are not the best.
Right side set, left side bound. Left side cover, right side bound.
Targets. Repeat, drop targets. The need, targets are down.
Hey, ceasefire, targets down. Push left.
And this is when they're clearing the actual building. Okay. So once we had established that the team and squad live fire, or the team live fire was sufficient, we moved into a squad live fire. One of the things we did with the squad live fire is we had a Overwatch platoon. Now, this is not normal for a Bradley or a mechanized unit because mechanized units have Bradleys. They have Bushmaster cannons, 240s mounted on the Bradleys. But what we did is we took all the 240s from the individual platoons and attached them together to make a weapon squad of, I believe it was, I remember it was four 240s. Good question. 240 is a medium machine gun, and you'll see them being fired in this video. It's used to force enemy troops to take cover and or kill them from a distance as a squad or platoon is advancing on an objective to take the objective.
Hey, don't wait for enemies.
240 by 3 men.
Make sure he's fucking them. They're shooting the same. Gun.
Video. You can hear in the background my commander saying that they were shooting at the same target. So what's the use of having a machine gun if both machine guns are firing at the same exact target? You want to spread your fires along the objective. Okay. Once we complete our team and squad live fire was done, and our time as doing NIE and AWA was complete, we found out as a brigade we were being transitioned back to ForceCom, which meant we would be deployed again. We were expected to be deployed to Kuwait in the end of 2017. So we had a 9-month train up, during which it culminated at Fort Irwin, California at the National Training Center. Here's some pictures from that. Like I said, it was really, really hot. Living in the Mojave Desert for a month was not something I ever want to repeat again. But before that, we had a final in-station training at Fort Bliss called Iron Focus, which helped prepare us for NTC. There's just one quick, this will give you a little bit of a closer look at some of the...
What's the status on that 240?
So the last week we did an exercise called Iron Focus. It's our final home station training before we go to the National Training Center.
Is our medic dead? No. You are though.
Iron Focus is a very intense event. It's about 15 days, and it's meant to be intense. It's meant to prepare you for the National Training Center.
Over here on the right side!
So it really tests both our systems, not just our infantrymen and their ability to clear urban area, but it also focuses our ability on how do we destroy a conventional threat in this new environment that does take into account civilians on the battlefield, that does take into account collateral damage.
You without the smoke, move backwards, slowly.
So we put it in role players so that they act like regular civilians that you would normally encounter on the battlefield. So doctors, car mechanics, shop owners, normal civilians that a soldier might encounter when they come in to secure a seized territory. We do this training to give a more realistic scenario for troops coming into going into main training events such as National Training Center or future deployments such as Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth.
It's great training, you know, because it's not, when we go overseas, it's not a video game. You know, there's going to be civilians. There's real civilians there. So when we do the training, we do it as accurately as possible. So it's important that our soldiers get accustomed to that and get used to dealing with that. It's important to be as accurate as possible when it comes to real life situations, and that's what we provide.
And there's a shot of Bradley. So that's
Every one of our operations were a success out there, and you know, we couldn't be happier. The headquarters couldn't be happier with how the exercise went, and we think we are prepared for the National Training Center.
That back on the Zoom? Or continue? Okay, cool. Okay, I mentioned that I had, okay. Okay. Mentioned I had turnover in leadership. I had 3 platoon sergeants in my time as a platoon leader. One, Sergeant Hernandez on the right, or Staff Sergeant, and I think he finished up as a Sergeant First Class. And then now First Sergeant Rhino, he was a Sergeant First Class when I was at Fort Bliss. And then another Sergeant, Staff Sergeant Ochoa. So to give it in perspective, I was a platoon leader, if I remember correctly, for 16 months. During those 16 months, I had to work with 3 different people who helped run my platoon. So that required a lot of flexibility because each of these men brought a different style of leadership that I had to work with. So we had to become friends. sometimes just coworkers, and we had to make sure that we knew how to run a platoon and perform those team squad live fires going all the way up to NTC. Yeah, there's a lot of turnover in the Army. You go to a unit, you expect it to be stable. There's constantly movement. There's movement in leadership. There's movement among the soldiers. It's just sometimes hard to keep track of. Also, one thing I want to touch on is even though I never deployed overseas, never saw combat, I was in a combat-focused unit. Within that, unfortunate things do happen. During my time at Fort Bliss, we had 3 suicides in my company. 2 of which were suicides that happened that dramatically affected my platoon members because they were friends of members of my platoon. Some of these soldiers had never seen combat. It was just the stressors of military life that got to them. Family issues, mental illness, whatnot. I had one soldier who attempted suicide 3 times in my platoon before he was finally chaptered out of the Army, which, put in perspective, means he was forced to leave the Army because the Army didn't feel like he was a useful tool anymore. Within this, I want to highlight the fact that since 9/11 happened, we've only had just over 7,000 casualties in combat. On the other hand, 30,000 suicides. What's the real killer? I don't know. That's kind of up for you to decide. I have my personal beliefs, but I won't get into this slide. But I just wanted to touch on that because it's a major problem. And unfortunately, I think there's more focus on it than there was in the past, but I'd like to see more. And okay, kind of finish this off. Just want to talk a little bit about the social life that happens in the military. One of the things, it's all this running around, shooting guns, throwing grenades, doing PT in the morning. But one of the things that does happen is we have banquets, we have balls, we have events that we have to dress up for in formal uniforms. Something that I hated because this uniform is exceptionally uncomfortable. You'd agree with me, right? Was it pretty bad? Yeah, did you have to wear this one? No, I was talking to Andrew. Sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, it sucked. Yeah, it's a really crappy uniform. So, Dr. Matson. Well, at that point, you weren't doctor, right, babe? Okay. Dr. Matson, right there, and myself at the ball, which she helped plan with the battalion commander's wife. So the battalion commander is a lieutenant colonel, and Elizabeth was the one who helped put this all together. Now, here's just a video of the beginning of the ball where we are all singing the Army song, which is drilled into all of us at a very early portion of our. Why is this not working? There we go. Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won, and the Army goes rolling along. It's high, high, hey, the Army's on its way. Count off the cadence loud and strong. Wherever we go, you always know that the Army goes rolling along. Just realize, oh, there we go. Okay, so we have that beginning of the ball. Really nice, kind of formal. We're all dressed up. Well, what happens next is called the grog ceremony. Does anyone have any idea what the grog ceremony is? Okay, so the grog ceremony is when members of the battalion, usually command captains and first sergeants, are brought up to a punch bowl. And then they take an alcoholic beverage, which is representative of a conflict that the battalion served in throughout history. They then guzzle said bottle and then pour it into the punch bowl. And that keeps happening through every conflict the battalion was in. And then that punch is served to all the soldiers in the battalion. How do you think this went, guys? Here's a couple of videos to end my presentation, because I think it really kind of shows a little bit of kind of how the battalion can act. Come on. That went on for a few hours, to give you an idea. So, I don't need to hear you swearing anymore, Eli. Okay. Questions? Because, yes.
Microphone so that people on Zoom can hear it. They won't hear your question.
Until that last slide or whatever you call it, of social life, there were no females that I saw in the entire presentation.
Why is that?
Since I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 15% of the Army now is now female.
Okay, so one of the big deals that I had was I was one of the last generation of infantry officers to serve in an all-male infantry branch. So as I was leaving, we were getting the first recruits from both basic training and then officers that were branched infantry. So I actually never served with a woman in the infantry. I did serve with women who were in the battalion, but they were in non-infantry related fields. So to be honest, I rarely saw them on a daily basis. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Any?
Can you comment, how was your transition going from such a highly structured, very regimented lifestyle with a community with its own standards to all of a sudden being a civilian?
To be honest, it's kind of sucked. I think one of the best things for myself and Elizabeth was we had just had a newborn. So that kind of like shoved our entire life into a crazy tailspin as it was. So because of it, really our focus was take care of the kid, figure out where she was going for a job, which ended up being here, and kind of just figure out life on the outside world. So we got to do that together. To be honest, I think some of the pain came a little bit later. Once my son was a little bit older, once I had room to breathe and kind of figure out, oh, I'm a civilian now. I need to start acting like a civilian. I would say those problems came a little bit. And to be honest, I'm still struggling with them sometimes.
Thank you for that, Isaac. The Army is hurting for recruits. What would you say the Army did wrong, in your opinion, kind of in the last few years? And what are some of the remedies to kind of make Americans want to serve in the U.S. Army?
I think my big issue with how the Army addressed recruiting was not so much recruiting, but it was retention. They didn't retain soldiers that would have been good. For example, I was at a moment in my time in the Army where I considered staying in, but the Army wasn't giving me what I wanted. Now, I know that sounds selfish of me, but if I'm going to serve in a position where I'm away from my family, potentially deployed overseas and potentially seeing combat, I want a little bit of support from the institution as a whole. So the Army lost a lot of good officers and enlisted soldiers just at Fort Bliss and just in my tenure at Fort Bliss. So I don't know for the whole Army, but I would say that's one of the major issues. And then we instead focus, or the Army focuses, on getting new recruits every single year that then just go through that entire cycle again, decide that, nah, civilian life's better, and they move out. Plus, there's the overhead of having to pay said soldiers for disability that is incurred during the Army, which then goes to the time that the abundance of soldiers or veterans that are utilizing the VA system, which is a necessary system, but it costs money as well.
I have two questions.
Yes.
First question is, how dangerous is the training? Were there many casualties or injuries?
We never had a casualty in my platoon or company while I was in. While that is the case, I almost died 3 times, myself personally, and there was a few other close calls that happened. I'll give you an example. We were hiding behind what's called a chia pet, which is a large sand dune with bushes on top of it, and myself and 3 other soldiers heard a rumbling sound. And all of a sudden, the enemy force that we were fighting against, another company, which happened to be an armor company, rolled a tank over the top of the burn. We ran as fast as we could, and I was screaming my CO over the radio to have them stop moving because they were potentially running over my platoon. Another example is we were in a shoot house. I was in the upper floor of the shoot house watching one of my fire teams go through the shoot house. Unfortunately, we had trained as a platoon to reload with your rifle up. In the shoot house, that's not appropriate because there's officers and NCOs in the gallery watching it. So I had a rifle pointed at me with live rounds. Did someone say something? Oh, sorry. And then the final one, grenades, man, they're awesome, but they're also terrifying. So I'll just leave it at that. Those are my own personal experiences, and then other guys I'm sure had some.
Okay. The other question I had was, if you could say something about the political culture in the army. It has the reputation of being kind of conservative. I wonder if that's true.
Okay, so I told you guys in the beginning, I kind of grew up in a conservative family. I became a progressive in the army, to put it in. I didn't fit in with the extreme conservative culture. Let's put it that way, which is kind of gives you an idea of how conservative the military can be. Not saying all the military is like that. Some of my NCOs, Sergeant Rhino, myself and him kind of fit when it came down to our political views. But there is a large number of people that I would say end up on the far right of the spectrum. Does that answer your question? I could get into more with that, but I mean, that gets really political, and I'm not really sure if I want.
In general.
Generally, it leans right, but then you could just look at like things like the January 6th insurrections and pick out former military members that are there. There's so many things that I could say about that, but that would be an entire forum unto itself.
So you touched on this a little bit when you answered Emrys's question about the dangers in training, but I'm wondering what communication is like in general. You mentioned that you communicate via radio, and what are some of the issues and if improving some of those problems, or how things are communicated, because I think it's generally the cause of the source of many problems in the world. And if it might help with, or just what your experience was like.
So you're saying in terms of like how we communicated, or okay. So communication, we would utilize yelling a lot. My son calls my angry voice army voice because I scream really loudly sometimes. Okay. Sometimes you don't, sometimes you do, but that's why there's yelling, there's hand signals. For example, I could be like, move the 240 up to the 3rd floor now. That's an example of what could happen. Yes, I would get very hoarse. Same time, I could use my radio and contact the squad leader of said squad that had the 240 and be like, move that 240 up to the 3rd floor right now. But if that didn't work and I was too far away to make the yell, I might yell at one of my soldiers right next to me, hey, Ramirez, run over to Sergeant Teets and go tell him to move the 240 up there. We also might have pre-designated communications depending on what the mission is. Like I throw a smoke grenade and 3rd squad advances towards the objective. That gives you an idea. So there's different means by which, and that what happened is before a mission took place, I would conduct an op order where I would talk through the forms of communication that we would be utilizing in that particular mission. Generally, as a platoon, we use the same ones over and over again, but in certain cases, like a night mission or just an abnormal situation, we would add more methods to our communication. Does that answer your question? Okay. That sucks, but it's happened a lot, and you just kind of have to roll with it. A lot of my time was plan, and everything goes out the window, and then you're just like flying by your ass, basically. And I didn't like it, but ended up doing it a lot.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
So you started as an officer, right?
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends from like high school that talked about how, so a couple of them are actually going as an officer, and they speak a lot about how starting as an officer, everyone else hates you because you didn't go in like starting out without like being an officer, without having a title. Do you have that same experience?
Well, it's a little bit different. I hear what you're saying. So the idea of like enlisted hate officers, no matter who the officers are. Generally, I think my soldiers liked me because I treated them like humans. Not all officers did that. Some got the entire like, I'm an officer, you bow down to me mentality a little bit too much. I think the bigger problem was the classes of officers. So I was OCS, which tended to have a lot of the NCOs that were transitioning who had did that time as an enlisted soldier and were transitioning to the officer class. Then there's the ROTC, which you have here at Alfred University, and then West Pointers, which would be West Point, the Army Military Academy down in West Point, which those guys are the creme de la creme, like top of the, they kind of think they're really hot stuff. So I have a thing against West Pointers other than my CO, who was awesome. I wouldn't say there was much pushback unless you were just a crappy officer. As long as you listen to your NCOs and you listen to the wisdom that they had from their experiences in combat and just being in the Army, it made life very, very doable. Were there crappy NCOs? Yes. Were there crappy officers? Absolutely. Yeah. But does that answer your question? Okay, cool.
Well, thank you, Isaac, for a wonderful, enlightening window on a world that most of us don't know much about. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you very much.